Most people think high blood sugar only comes from eating too much sugar. But here's the truth. Some of the worst blood sugar spikes happen when you haven't eaten anything at all, overnight, early morning, even during fasting. So where's that glucose coming from? The answer is your liver. Your liver has one major job: store sugar after meals and release small amounts when you need energy. But in insulin resistance, something strange happens. The liver stops listening to insulin's signal to shut off. Instead of slowing down, it keeps producing glucose nonstop, almost like a faucet that won't close. This is what many experts call the hidden glucose leak, and it's one of the earliest, most overlooked drivers of type 2 diabetes, long before the pancreas fails. In fact, many people are told their diet is the only issue when the real problem begins deeper inside the liver. So today we're going to uncover what hepatic insulin resistance really is, why the liver keeps releasing sugar even when it shouldn't, and what this means for your metabolism and health. Let's break it down. To understand insulin resistance in the liver, we first need to understand what the liver is supposed to do in the first place. Most people think blood sugar is controlled only by what you eat. Eat carbs and blood sugar rises. Don't eat carbs, blood sugar falls. But that's only half the story, because even when you're not eating, your body still needs glucose. Your brain alone requires a constant supply of sugar to function. Your red blood cells depend on it. And during sleep, fasting, or even between meals, your body can't just shut energy production down. That's where the liver comes in. The liver acts like a glucose bank. After you eat, glucose enters your bloodstream. Insulin rises, and insulin tells the liver, store this extra sugar. We don't need it floating around right now. So the liver takes glucose and stores it as glycogen. Then hours later, when blood sugar begins to drop, your liver slowly releases small amounts back into the bloodstream. This process is tightly regulated. In a healthy person, insulin works like a switch. High insulin equals liver stops producing glucose. Low insulin equals liver releases glucose gradually. This balance keeps blood sugar stable all day and all night. But here's the key. Your liver doesn't just store glucose. It can also create glucose from scratch. This is called gluconeogenesis. Even if you haven't eaten in 12 hours, your liver can manufacture sugar from amino acids, lactate, and other raw materials. That's a survival mechanism. And historically, it's what kept humans alive during famine or long periods without food. Your liver is designed to protect you from low blood sugar. It's basically your built-in emergency generator. But it's only supposed to activate when insulin is low. Insulin's job is to suppress that glucose production. So in a normal metabolic system, insulin tells the liver, stop making sugar. We already have enough. And the liver listens. But when insulin resistance begins, the liver stops responding. And that's where the glucose leak starts. The liver keeps producing glucose even when it shouldn't. So instead of blood sugar falling during fasting, it rises. This is why many people first discover metabolic dysfunction through elevated morning glucose. Not after dessert, but after doing nothing at all. And this is often where confusion begins. People will say, I'm eating less. I'm skipping breakfast. I'm trying to fast. But their morning glucose numbers stay high. That's because the problem isn't only what's coming in, it's what the liver is releasing from within. The liver starts acting as if the body is starving, even when it isn't. It keeps dumping sugar into the bloodstream as if it's stuck in survival mode. And over time, this constant glucose output forces the pancreas to release more and more insulin just to keep blood sugar under control. That's how early insulin resistance turns into full metabolic disease. And scientists have actually measured this. In people with insulin resistance and early type 2 diabetes, Research shows that the liver becomes the single biggest source of excess glucose in the bloodstream, especially during the fasting state. In fact, the majority of high fasting sugar comes not from food, but from unchecked hepatic glucose production. This happens because insulin normally suppresses two major liver processes: the breakdown of stored glycogen and the creation of new glucose through gluconeogenesis. But when liver cells become insulin resistant, that suppression weakens. So the liver continues releasing sugar as if the body is constantly in need of fuel. This is also why fatty liver disease is so strongly connected to diabetes. Excess fat inside liver cells disrupts insulin signaling, making the glucose leak worse over time. So for many people, type 2 diabetes doesn't begin with the pancreas. It begins with a liver that can't stop producing sugar. So the liver is not just a passive storage organ, it's one of the first places where type 2 diabetes truly begins. This is the liver's hidden role in diabetes, and most people never learn it. And what makes this even more important is that this liver dysfunction often happens silently for years. Someone may have completely normal blood sugar after meals, but their fasting glucose slowly creeps upward because the liver is overproducing sugar in the background. Doctors sometimes call this the earliest stage of metabolic disease, and it's why fasting blood sugar is such a powerful warning sign. Because before diabetes becomes obvious, the liver is already losing its ability to regulate glucose properly. Now let's talk about what liver insulin resistance really is. Because insulin resistance isn't just one thing. It's not simply that your body doesn't handle sugar well, it's more specific. Hepatic insulin resistance means that the liver becomes numb to insulin signal. Insulin is supposed to act like a stop sign. When insulin rises, the liver should immediately reduce glucose output. But in insulin resistance, that stop sign fades. The liver keeps producing sugar even though insulin is knocking at the door. And this is one of the earliest metabolic breakdowns in type 2 diabetes. It often happens years before full diabetes develops. Here's what's happening underneath the surface. The liver has insulin receptors. When insulin binds, it activates signaling pathways that shut down glucose production. But over time, because of excess fat, inflammation, and constant metabolic overload, those pathways become impaired. The liver basically becomes insulin blind, so the pancreas releases more insulin to compensate. Blood insulin levels climb higher and higher, but the liver still refuses to respond fully. So now you get a dangerous combination: high insulin, high glucose production, rising fasting blood sugar. That's the leak. Even in the fasting state, glucose continues to pour out, and it's not subtle. Studies show that excessive hepatic gluconeogenesis is a major driver of fasting hyperglycemia in type 2 diabetes. In simple terms, most fasting high blood sugar comes from the liver, not the food. This is why people can wake up with glucose readings of 110, 120, even 140 without eating anything. The liver is producing sugar on autopilot, and the body can't shut it down. But here's an important detail. The liver produces glucose through two major processes. First, it breaks down stored glycogen. Second, it creates entirely new glucose through gluconeogenesis. In early insulin resistance, gluconeogenesis becomes especially overactive. That means the liver is literally manufacturing sugar even when the bloodstream already has plenty. This is one of the clearest biochemical signs of hepatic insulin resistance. Now, why does this happen? One major reason is fat accumulation in the liver. When fat builds up inside liver cells, it interferes with insulin signaling. This condition is often called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or NAFLD, and it's incredibly common. In fact, fatty liver is considered one of the strongest predictors of future type 2 diabetes. The more liver fat someone has, the more resistant the liver becomes to insulin's ability to suppress glucose output. Inflammation also plays a major role. When the liver becomes inflamed, it releases stress signals and cytokines that further block insulin pathways. So it becomes a metabolic traffic jam. Insulin is trying to signal stop. But fat and inflammation are creating so much interference that the message never fully gets through. Another hidden contributor is constant high insulin itself. Many people don't realize that hyperinsulinemia can come first. When insulin is elevated for years due to frequent eating, refined carbs, or excess body fat, the liver's receptors can become desensitized. So the liver starts ignoring insulin, not because insulin is absent, but because insulin has been shouting for too long. And this creates a dangerous progression. The pancreas works harder, insulin rises, the liver keeps leaking glucose, blood sugar rises further, and eventually the pancreas begins to burn out. So by the time someone is diagnosed with diabetes, hepatic insulin resistance has often been present for a long time. But here's what makes this even more confusing. The liver isn't completely resistant to insulin, it's selectively resistant. And that leads us to the next critical paradox. Researchers have found that liver insulin resistance is often the very first step in the metabolic domino effect. Long before blood sugar becomes severely abnormal, the liver begins overproducing glucose in the background. That's why fasting glucose and fasting insulin are such important early markers. Someone can look completely normal on the outside, while internally their liver is already resisting insulin's braking signal. Even a small increase in liver fat can disrupt insulin signaling. So hepatic insulin resistance can develop before someone becomes visibly overweight. It's not just about body size. It's about what's happening inside liver cells. And once the liver begins leaking glucose, it helps set the stage for type 2 diabetes. Here's one of the strangest truths in metabolic disease, in liver insulin resistance. The liver ignores insulin when it comes to glucose, but still listens to insulin when it comes to fat. This is called selective hepatic insulin resistance. And it's one of the reasons fatty liver and diabetes are so tightly linked. Let's break it down. Insulin has multiple roles in the liver: suppress glucose production, promote glycogen storage, stimulate fat synthesis. In a healthy system, insulin does all three in balance. But in insulin resistance, the liver becomes resistant only to insulin's glucose-suppressing effects, while remaining sensitive to insulin's fat-building effects. So what happens? The liver keeps releasing glucose, and at the same time, it keeps producing fat. This is why people develop fatty liver disease, high triglycerides, elevated fasting glucose, metabolic syndrome, all at once. Even though insulin is high, the liver still pumps sugar out, but insulin still activates lipogenesis pathways, turning excess energy into fat. So the liver becomes overloaded. Fat accumulates inside liver cells. Inflammation increases, insulin signaling becomes even worse, and the glucose leak accelerates. This creates a vicious cycle. Fatty liver drives insulin resistance. Insulin resistance drives glucose overproduction. High glucose drives high insulin. High insulin drives more fat storage. Round and round. Now, why does the liver keep responding to insulin's fat signal, but not the glucose signal? This is where the paradox becomes fascinating. Inside liver cells, insulin signals through different molecular branches. One branch is supposed to shut down gluconeogenesis. Another branch stimulates fat synthesis through pathways involving SREBP1C, a major gene regulator of lipogenesis. In selective insulin resistance, the glucose-suppressing branch becomes impaired, but the fat-producing branch remains active. So insulin loses its ability to stop sugar output, yet still drives fat production forward. This is why fatty liver can worsen even when the liver is already insulin resistant. And this is one reason modern diets cause such damage. When insulin stays elevated all day, from frequent meals, sugar, refined starches, or constant snacking, the liver is repeatedly pushed into fat storage mode. Over time, fat builds up inside hepatocytes, the liver's main cells. This fat is not harmless. It creates metabolic stress. Fat droplets interfere with insulin receptor signaling. They trigger oxidative stress, and they promote chronic inflammation. This is why fatty liver disease is now considered the liver-based manifestation of metabolic syndrome. And importantly, fatty liver is not just a symptom, it is a driver. Studies consistently show that people with NAFLD have a much higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes, even if their blood sugar is still normal today. The liver becomes both a glucose producer and a fat reservoir at the same time. And once fat reaches a tipping point, the liver can begin exporting that fat into the bloodstream. This is how insulin resistance spreads. The liver packages fat into VLDL particles, which raise triglycerides. Those fats then accumulate in muscle tissue in the pancreas, making insulin resistance a whole-body problem. So what begins as a liver issue becomes systemic metabolic disease. And here's another key point. This paradox explains why some people have both high insulin and high glucose at the same time. People assume insulin should always lower blood sugar, but when the liver is resistant, insulin can be extremely high. Yet glucose production continues, so the body ends up trapped in an energy overload state. Glucose can't be stored properly. Fat keeps accumulating. Insulin keeps rising. That's why metabolic syndrome is not just a little extra weight. It is a hormonal and organ-level dysfunction. And this is why treating type 2 diabetes isn't only about cutting carbs. It's about fixing liver metabolism. Because the liver is stuck in a pathological state, producing sugar when it shouldn't, and storing fat when it shouldn't. To understand the molecular trigger behind this, we need to look at what's happening inside liver cells. So what actually causes this glucose leak at the cellular level? One of the most important regulators is a protein called FOXO1. FOXO1 is essentially a glucose production switch. When FOXO1 is active, the liver turns on genes that create glucose. The two main ones are PEPCK, G6-PACE. These enzymes drive gluconeogenesis. Now in a healthy body, insulin turns FOXO1 off. Insulin signals, we have enough sugar, shut down glucose production. FOXO1 is suppressed. Glucose output decreases. But in hepatic insulin resistance, insulin can't shut FOXO1 down properly. So FOXO1 remains active. The liver keeps producing glucose even when insulin is high. That is the biochemical foundation of the glucose leak. And this isn't just theory. It's been clearly demonstrated in metabolic research showing FOXO1 as a key driver of excessive hepatic glucose output. But FOXO1 is only part of the story because insulin resistance in the liver involves an entire network of disrupted signaling. Normally, insulin activates a pathway called PI3K to act. This pathway is what tells the liver to stop gluconeogenesis and store glucose. AKT is especially important because it directly phosphorylates FOXO1 and pushes it out of the nucleus, essentially turning it off. But when insulin signaling becomes impaired, ACT activation weakens. FOXO1 stays switched on, and gluconeogenesis continues. So even though insulin is present, The liver behaves as if insulin is absent. Now, another major factor behind liver insulin resistance is mitochondrial stress. The liver is packed with mitochondria because it is constantly processing nutrients. But when the liver becomes overloaded with fat, especially from excess calories and refined carbohydrates, mitochondria begin producing excess reactive oxygen species. This oxidative stress damages insulin signaling further. It's like the liver's energy factories become overwhelmed, and that metabolic overload reinforces the glucose leak. Inflammation plays a role here too. As liver fat builds up, inflammatory pathways like JNK and NFKB become activated. These pathways directly interfere with insulin receptor signaling. So the liver becomes locked into a state of resistance. FOXO1 stays active. Glucose production stays high. Fat continues accumulating. Inflammation increases. This is why fatty liver disease is not a side issue. It's central to the entire process. And this is also why hepatic insulin resistance is one of the strongest early predictors of type 2 diabetes progression. But now here's the hopeful part. The liver is one of the most reversible organs metabolically. Unlike some tissues, liver insulin sensitivity can improve dramatically when liver fat decreases. This is why researchers have found that reducing liver fat is one of the fastest ways to reduce fasting glucose. What helps? The strongest evidence supports weight loss of even 5 to 10%, exercise, especially after meals, reducing refined carbs and ultra-processed foods, improving fatty liver disease, fasting strategies under medical supervision. Even short-term reductions in liver fat have been shown to restore insulin's ability to suppress glucose production. For example, studies of calorie restriction have shown improvements in hepatic insulin sensitivity within just days to weeks, even before major weight changes happen. That's how responsive the liver is. Exercise is powerful because it helps muscles absorb glucose without needing as much insulin. That lowers insulin demand and reduces the constant hormonal pressure on the liver. And reducing refined carbohydrates lowers the liver's exposure to continuous glucose spikes and insulin surges. Another key factor is improving metabolic flexibility. A healthy liver should be able to switch smoothly between storing energy and releasing energy. But insulin resistance traps the liver in constant overproduction. The goal of lifestyle intervention is to restore that flexibility. So the glucose leak is not permanent. It's a signal, a warning light that the liver is overwhelmed. And the earlier you address it, the more reversible it becomes. Because liver insulin resistance is often the beginning of type 2 diabetes, not the end stage. The faucet can be turned off. But first, people need to understand what's really happening. What's important to understand is that insulin resistance is not just a blood sugar problem, it's a signaling problem. And in many cases, the liver is where the whole process begins. This is where most people get it wrong. They focus only on what they eat, without realizing that the liver can keep producing glucose internally, even during fasting, even when insulin is high. That glucose leak isn't random. It's the result of disrupted metabolic communication driven by fat accumulation, inflammation, and pathways like FOXO1 staying switched on. And the good news is that the liver is also one of the most responsive organs when the underlying mechanisms are addressed early. Small changes can have surprisingly powerful effects when you understand the root cause rather than just chasing symptoms. If you want more videos that explain metabolism clearly, without confusion or oversimplification, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Because once you understand what's happening inside the body, the entire picture changes. And that's where real progress begins.